Welcome to Life Stories. In today's tale, we journey to a quiet village where an elderly woman named Margaret and her unusual companion, Midnight, face the trials of suspicion, fear, and courage. What starts as mere whispers of doubt transforms into a story of unbreakable bonds and life-changing lessons. How does Midnight, with his watchful amber eyes, become the guardian of not just Margaret but an entire community? Stay with us as we unravel this touching story of resilience, loyalty, and transformation. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories and start today's incredible journey with us. Margaret lived a quiet life in a quaint suburban neighborhood on the edge of sprawling woods. At 67, the retired nurse had carved out a routine that kept her days busy but predictable. Her mornings were spent tending the small garden outside her modest home, while the afternoons were reserved for tea on her porch, accompanied by the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Her neighborhood was a peaceful one, where most people knew each other, though the community's warmth often felt like a distant memory for Margaret. It had been 5 years since her husband, Harold, passed away. He had been her anchor, her partner in every sense, and his absence left a void that no amount of gardening or tea could fill. Her children, both grown, lived far away, immersed in their bustling city lives. They visited occasionally, but the calls and rare embraces only emphasized how solitary her life had become. Yet, Margaret never complained. She had her memories, her garden, and the soothing predictability of her days. One crisp autumn morning, as she trimmed the hedges near the edge of her property, she felt a shiver of something unusual, like being watched. Turning her head, she spotted movement near the woods. A shadow shifted among the trees before emerging into the sunlight. Her breath caught as she locked eyes with the creature standing just beyond the fence. At first glance, she thought it was a dog. Its sleek black coat shimmered in the sunlight, and its piercing amber eyes seemed to hold an uncanny intelligence. But there was something about its posture, calm yet powerful, that suggested this was no ordinary pet. The creature, standing tall and steady, tilted its head slightly, as though assessing her. "Hello there," Margaret said softly, her voice trembling. She gripped her shears tightly, unsure whether to feel fear or awe. The animal didn't growl or bark. It simply sat, its gaze unwavering, a faint limp in its front leg betraying an injury. Margaret's instincts as a nurse took over. "You've been hurt, haven't you?" she murmured, taking a cautious step forward. The creature didn't retreat, though its amber eyes followed her every move. She fetched a bowl of water and a piece of bread, setting them down a few feet away. The animal approached slowly, sniffing the offerings before accepting them. Encouraged, Margaret knelt, extending her hand. To her surprise, the creature allowed her to stroke its fur, which was surprisingly soft despite its rugged appearance. From that day forward, the creature, which Margaret named Midnight, became a part of her life. Midnight followed her on walks, his lithe frame a shadow beside her, and often lay by her feet as she read or knitted by the fire. His presence, though silent, filled her days with a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in years. He was a protector, a guardian in the truest sense, and Margaret found herself smiling more often. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared her sentiments. While Margaret saw Midnight as a blessing, her neighbors viewed him with suspicion. The animal's size, coupled with his intense gaze, unsettled them. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly widow who ran the corner bakery, commented one morning, "That's an odd-looking dog you've got there, Margaret. Are you sure it's safe?" Margaret only smiled. "Midnight is gentle as they come. He wouldn't hurt a fly." Yet whispers began to spread. Mr. Jones, the town butcher, muttered under his breath as Margaret bought her weekly cut of lamb, "That's no dog. Looks like it wandered down from the wild. Dangerous, if you ask me." Margaret dismissed their concerns with her characteristic patience. But the unease in the community grew. People began crossing the street to avoid her and Midnight during their walks. Even Mrs. Thompson, once a regular visitor for tea, made excuses to stay away. Despite the growing tension, Margaret couldn't imagine her life without Midnight. One evening, as she locked up for the night, she noticed him standing by the window, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the street. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Margaret asked, placing a hand on his back. Midnight didn't move, his eyes scanning the darkness, though she saw nothing unusual. His unease made her skin prickle. Midnight remained by the door that night, his ears twitching at the slightest sound, his presence a silent assurance. Margaret found herself marveling at the bond she and Midnight had forged. He was more than a pet, he was a companion who filled the empty corners of her life. She couldn't understand why the neighbors couldn't see what she did. Midnight was not a threat. He was her protector, her shadow, and her heart felt less heavy with him by her side. Yet, in the quiet of her home, she couldn't shake the feeling that this peace was fragile, as though a storm loomed just beyond the horizon. The unease surrounding Midnight grew in the village as days turned into weeks. Margaret's once cordial neighbors had become distant, their polite nods replaced by cold stares and whispered conversations as she passed. Midnight remained her loyal shadow, following her on errands and standing watch by her side. Yet, Margaret couldn't ignore the growing tension every time she stepped outside with him. It wasn't just whispers anymore. The fear of Midnight had turned into outright speculation. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he was a wolf. Others claimed he was a dangerous wild animal from the nearby woods. The more imaginative ones insisted he was a bad omen, a harbinger of misfortune for the village. Margaret overheard snippets of these conversations during her trips to the market, the words stinging more than she cared to admit. One morning, as she approached the butcher's stall, Mr. Jones gave her a wary glance before leaning in and lowering his voice. "Margaret, I've known you for years. But that animal, it doesn't seem right. Too quiet. Too watchful. Are you sure he's just a dog?" Margaret sighed, her patience wearing thin. "Midnight is my companion, Mr. Jones. He's never harmed anyone. Perhaps you should stop listening to gossip." But the murmurs persisted. Even Mrs. Thompson, once her closest confidant, avoided her eyes during their rare encounters. The isolation was palpable. But Margaret refused to let it sway her. Midnight had given her life new meaning, and she wouldn't abandon him for anyone. The tension reached a boiling point one chilly evening. As Margaret prepared supper, she heard raised voices outside her window. Peeking through the curtains, she saw a small group of young men gathered near her fence, their expressions tense and confrontational. Among them was Jacob, a burly man known for stirring trouble. "What's she doing with that thing?" Jacob hissed, his voice loud enough for Margaret to hear. "It's dangerous. We can't let it stay." Midnight, lying near the door, lifted his head and let out a low growl. His amber eyes locked on the group, his body tense. Margaret felt a surge of fear but quickly steeled herself. She wasn't one to back down. Grabbing her shawl, she stepped outside, her voice firm. "Is there a problem?" The men turned to face her, their bravado faltering slightly at the sight of her resolute expression. Jacob stepped forward, his tone feigning politeness. "We're just concerned. Margaret. That animal of yours, it's not safe. Someone might get hurt." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Midnight has done nothing to harm anyone. He's as much a part of my home as my garden or the roof over my head. Now, if you'll excuse us, we'd like some peace." Jacob hesitated, his jaw tightening. The group exchanged uncertain glances before retreating into the night, their murmurs fading into the darkness. Midnight remained by Margaret's side, his gaze fixed on the departing figures until they were out of sight. That night, sleep eluded her. Midnight's restless pacing and occasional growls only heightened her anxiety. The peaceful life she had cherished felt fragile, as though it could shatter at any moment. She knew that the villagers' fear was irrational. But fear had a way of turning people into something unrecognizable. Her concerns proved valid a few nights later. Margaret was jolted awake by the sound of her garden gate clanging in the wind. Midnight was already on high alert, his growls low and menacing. Grabbing her flashlight, she followed him to the front porch. The beam of light revealed a hooded figure crouching near her shed. Before Margaret could react, Midnight lunged forward, his powerful frame moving with startling speed. The intruder yelped, stumbling backward as Midnight cornered them against the shed, his growls echoing in the still night. "Wait, wait," the figure stammered, raising their hands in surrender. "I wasn't doing anything." Margaret's flashlight illuminated the intruder's face. It was Jacob. Anger bubbled inside her as she demanded, "What on earth are you doing here?" Jacob stammered, his bravado replaced by feeble excuses. I was just checking to see if everything was all right." Margaret's voice turned icy. "By sneaking onto my property in the middle of the night?" "Enough." Midnight. At her command, Midnight relented, stepping back with a warning growl. Jacob scrambled to his feet, muttering something about protecting the village before disappearing into the shadows. Margaret stood there, trembling with a mix of anger and fear. She knelt beside Midnight, her voice soft. "They don't understand you, do they? But I do. You're my protector, and I won't let anyone take you from me." Midnight pressed his head against her leg, his warmth a small comfort against the growing storm. As Margaret gazed into the darkened woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over. The morning after Jacob's intrusion, Margaret awoke with a lingering unease. The memory of the night before was fresh in her mind, and the faint tension in the air seemed more oppressive than ever. Midnight stayed close to her, his movements sharp and deliberate, as though anticipating another threat. When she ventured to the village market later that day, the usual cold stares felt sharper, and the whispers seemed louder. Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Turner, who usually stopped for a brief chat, hurried past her without a word, her expression uneasy. "Morning, Mrs. Turner," Margaret greeted, forcing cheer into her voice. But Mrs. Turner only nodded briskly, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The market's hum of activity quieted when Jacob appeared, a fresh bandage wrapped around his forearm, a stark reminder of his encounter with Midnight. Margaret watched as Jacob whispered to a few villagers. Their glances toward her were fleeting yet filled with unease. At the butcher's stall, Mr. Jones leaned in with a low voice. "Margot, people are talking. They're afraid. Maybe it's time to reconsider keeping Midnight." Margaret's grip on her basket tightened. "Midnight is family, Mr. Jones. I won't abandon him because of fear." The butcher sighed, his gaze lingering as Margaret walked away. The unease in the market mirrored the storm brewing in her heart. That evening, as Margaret sat by the fire, a sudden crash shattered the quiet. Midnight bolted to the door, growling fiercely. Margaret's heart raced as she grabbed her flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. Her light landed on the source, a rock, its jagged edges glinting under the porch light. Her breath caught when she saw the crude note scrawled on its surface, "Get rid of it or we will." Trembling, Margaret clutched the note as Midnight pressed against her leg, his body tense. "What do we do, boy?" she whispered, sinking into a chair. Midnight's warm presence was her only comfort as her mind raced with possibilities. The threat was unmistakable, and Margaret knew the situation was spiraling beyond her control. Desperate for advice, Margaret crossed the narrow lane to Mrs. Turner's cottage the next morning. Clutching the threatening note in her hands, Mrs. Turner opened the door cautiously, her face weary. "I need to talk to you," Margaret said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She laid the note on the table. "Do you know who could have done this?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. Mrs. Turner sighed. Her lips pressed into a thin line. People are scared. Margaret. Midnight isn't like the dogs they're used to. He's too different. Fear doesn't need proof, it's enough that they think he's dangerous. Margaret's frustration bubbled over. But he's not dangerous. Midnight has only ever protected me. Why can't they see that? Because fear blinds people. Mrs. Turner replied quietly. And fear can turn to anger if it's not addressed. Margaret left the cottage with a heavy heart. Mrs. Turner's words echoed in her mind. The fear surrounding midnight wasn't based on reason. And convincing the villagers otherwise felt like an insurmountable task. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, Midnight became restless again. He growled low, pacing near the door. A sudden loud crash outside sent Margaret scrambling for her flashlight. She followed Midnight into the garden, her heart pounding. The sight that greeted her sent chills down her spine. Her flower beds were trampled, tools scattered, and the fence bore a fresh, deliberate cut. Midnight growled, his body a tense shadow against the dim moonlight. The beam of her flashlight revealed something glinting in the grass, a steel trap. The kind hunters used. Margaret's breath hitched. Someone had gone beyond threats. They were trying to harm Midnight. She brought him inside, her hands trembling as she locked every door and window. Sitting by the fire, she stroked Midnight's fur, tears stinging her eyes. They won't stop. Will they? She whispered. Midnight pressed against her, his warmth a reassurance against the storm of emotions churning within her. Margaret stayed awake long into the night, knowing one thing for certain: the villagers' fear was escalating. And she and Midnight were running out of time. The following morning, Margaret woke to the sound of raised voices outside her window. Her stomach tightened as she peered out to see a small group of villagers gathered near her garden. Their faces were tense, their posture confrontational. At the center of the group stood Jacob, gesturing animatedly toward her house. Midnight, ever watchful, was already at the door, his body taut and alert. Margaret slipped on her coat and stepped outside, her heart pounding. Midnight followed close behind, his presence a steadying force against the rising tide of anxiety. The morning air felt heavy, laden with unease. "What's going on here?" Margaret demanded, her voice steady despite the fear tightening her chest. Jacob turned to face her, a smirk playing on his lips. "We've had enough, Margaret," he said, loud enough for the assembled crowd to hear. "That animal of yours, it's not safe. We won't stand by while it threatens the village." A low growl rumbled from Midnight, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Several villagers stepped back, uneasy under the intense amber gaze of the lynx-like creature. Margaret raised her chin, her resolve hardening. "Midnight has never hurt anyone unprovoked," she said firmly. "He's only ever protected me and this property from people who don't belong here." Her gaze settled pointedly on Jacob, whose face darkened. "Tell that to my arm." Jacob shot back, raising his bandaged limb for effect. "What happens when he decides someone else is a threat? A child? An innocent passerby? Are we supposed to wait for that?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Margaret's chest tightened. She knew they feared Midnight, but she also knew their fears were misplaced. "He's protecting me," she said, her voice unwavering, "from threats like the rock someone threw through my window or the trap set in my garden. If anyone here is a danger, it's not Midnight." Her words hung in the air, the crowd's unease shifting into uncertainty. Even Jacob seemed momentarily at a loss for a retort. Before anyone could respond, Midnight barked sharply, his body rigid as he turned toward the edge of the yard. His alertness sent a ripple of unease through the villagers. "What's he barking at now?" Jacob sneered, though his voice carried a note of hesitation. Margaret followed Midnight's gaze, her heart racing. The trees lining the property swayed in the breeze, their shadows flickering ominously. For a moment, all was silent. Then, from the edge of the woods, a figure emerged. It was a young girl. Her face pale and tear-streaked. She clutched a small bundle to her chest. Her eyes wide with fear. Margaret's instincts kicked in immediately. She stepped forward. Midnight at her side. His posture shifting from tense to protective. "It's okay, sweetheart," Margaret said gently. "What's wrong?" The girl hesitated, glancing nervously at Jacob and the others. "It's my brother," she whispered. "He's hurt. Badly. Please. You have to help." Jacob's face twisted in confusion. Then irritation. "What's this nonsense?" he barked. But Margaret ignored him. Her focus was entirely on the girl. "Take me to him," she said softly. The girl nodded, relief washing over her features. As she turned toward the woods, Margaret followed, Midnight close on her heels. Behind her, the crowd of villagers murmured in confusion. Jacob's protests faded into the background as Margaret's determination carried her forward. The trees closed around them, the sounds of the village falling away. The girl led them deeper into the woods until they reached a small clearing. A young boy lay on the ground, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. His face was pale, and his breathing shallow. Margaret knelt beside him, her nurse's instincts taking over. "He needs medical attention," she said firmly, looking up at the girl. "You did the right thing bringing me here." Midnight settled nearby, his eyes scanning the woods for any sign of danger. Margaret worked quickly, improvising a splint with materials from her bag. The boy winced but didn't cry out, his trust in Margaret evident. As she finished, the girl looked at Midnight, her eyes filled with awe. "He's not scary," she said softly. "He's helping." Margaret smiled, a warmth spreading through her despite the tension of the moment. "Yes, he is," she replied. "He's a protector." That evening, as Margaret and Midnight returned to the village with the children, the atmosphere had shifted. Whispers followed them, but they were tinged with something new, a hint of admiration, a seed of understanding. For the first time, Margaret felt that Midnight's presence was no longer seen as a threat but as a force for good. The fight was far from over, but Margaret knew they had taken the first step in changing the villagers' hearts. Together, she and Midnight would face whatever came next. The tension in the village didn't dissipate overnight. Margaret knew that trust was hard-won and fragile, particularly in a community bound by fear. But the rescue of the young boy had planted a seed of doubt in the villagers' perception of Midnight. Margaret could sense the shift, subtle but undeniable, as they navigated the days that followed. Morning routines returned, but there was an air of unease still clinging to the market square. As Margaret walked through with her basket, Midnight by her side, she noticed fewer averted eyes and hesitant nods of acknowledgement. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. "Morning, Margaret," said Henry, the butcher, his voice carrying a gruff warmth that hadn't been there before. "How's your dog?" Margaret smiled, grateful for the effort in his tone. "He's doing well, Henry. Keeping me safe, as always." The butcher nodded, his gaze flicking to Midnight. An unusual one. Never seen anything like him. Margaret sensed his unspoken thought, not just a dog. But she chose not to press it. "He's special," she said simply. As they left the butcher's stall, Margaret overheard murmurs from a group of villagers gathered near the bakery. Words floated toward her guardian, rescuer. Not so bad. She kept her head high, her heart swelling with cautious optimism. But not everyone was ready to let go of their fear. Jacob's hostility had not waned. If anything, it seemed to have deepened, fueled by his embarrassment and the growing whispers of Midnight's heroics. He stood on the edge of the square, his arms crossed, watching Margaret and Midnight with a dark scowl. "Don't let your guard down," he muttered to anyone who would listen. "One good deed doesn't change what it is. A wild animal's a wild animal." His words found a few sympathetic ears. But the tide was turning against him. Margaret noticed that even some of his usual allies hesitated. Their expressions conflicted. That evening, Margaret sat on her porch with midnight at her feet, the cool breeze carrying the scent of autumn leaves. She stroked Midnight's sleek fur, her thoughts heavy with the weight of the day. "They're starting to see." "Boy," she murmured. Midnight tilted his head, his amber eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity that always comforted her. "But Jacob, he won't stop." As if in response, Midnight's ears twitched, his body tensing. Margaret followed his gaze to the edge of the yard, where shadows flickered among the trees. A chill ran down her spine, but she refused to let fear take hold. "Let's go inside," she said softly, guiding Midnight back into the house. She double-checked the locks, her mind replaying the warning signs that danger still lurked nearby. The next day, Margaret decided to confront Jacob directly. She found him near the smithy, talking in low tones to a group of villagers. Her approach silenced their conversation, all eyes turning to her with varying degrees of wariness. "Jacob," she said firmly, her voice steady. "A word." He raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. The others began to drift away, sensing the tension. Margaret stood her ground. "This has gone far enough. I won't let your fear and lies put my home or Midnight at risk." Jacob snorted, folding his arms across his chest. "Your dog doesn't belong here, Margaret. He's a danger. And yet he's only ever protected me," she shot back. "And don't think I've forgotten the traps. The threats. If anything happens to him, I'll hold you responsible." His expression flickered with something unreadable anger, perhaps, but also something closer to uncertainty. For the first time, Margaret saw hesitation in his eyes. "Mark my words," she continued, her voice low but resolute. "You may not understand him, but you'll regret it if you keep pushing this." Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Midnight's sharp bark interrupted the tense standoff. Both turned to see a commotion at the far end of the square, a child crying, a small crowd gathering. Without hesitation, Midnight bolted toward the noise, Margaret close behind. When they arrived, they found a little boy clutching his ankle, tears streaming down his face. "He tripped on the loose cobblestone," someone explained. "Twisted his ankle, I think." Margaret knelt beside the boy, her nurse's instincts kicking in. Midnight, meanwhile, lay down beside the child, his presence calming the boy almost instantly. "Easy now," Margaret said, examining the injury. "It's not too bad. Let's get you home." As the child's mother arrived, her expression a mix of gratitude and relief, Margaret helped guide them to safety. Midnight followed, his quiet strength offering reassurance to everyone present. By the time they returned to the square, the atmosphere had shifted again. Whispers carried through the crowd, not of fear, but of admiration. Margaret caught Jacob watching, his scowl deepening. "They'll see the truth eventually," she said softly to Midnight. "And when they do, they'll understand." As they walked home that evening, Margaret felt the weight of the fight ahead. But with Midnight by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. The days following Midnight's intervention with the injured boy marked a significant turning point in the village. Margaret could feel the shift as she walked through the square. People who once avoided her now approached with tentative smiles. A young woman from the bakery handed her a loaf of fresh bread, her gaze lingering on Midnight. "Here's something special," the woman said, her voice soft but genuine. "I've never seen an animal like him." Margaret smiled, her heart warming at the gesture. "Thank you. Midnight has a way of showing us what we need to see." Despite these small victories, Margaret knew the battle for acceptance wasn't over. Jacob remained an ever-present threat, his resentment festering as more villagers began to see Midnight not as a danger but as a protector. Margaret couldn't let her guard down. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the village, Margaret sat on her porch with Midnight. She sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her as she reflected on the slow but steady progress they were making. Midnight lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, ever alert. "They're beginning to see," she murmured, running her fingers through his sleek fur. But Jacob won't give up easily. Midnight lifted his head, his amber eyes scanning the yard. Margaret followed his gaze, spotting movement among the trees. Her breath hitched, but she stayed calm, her trust in Midnight unshaken. As the shadows deepened, Margaret heard the crunch of footsteps approaching her gate. She rose, her heart pounding as she stepped forward to meet whoever was coming. To her surprise, it was Martin, the blacksmith. He stood there, his broad frame silhouetted against the fading light. "Margaret," he said, his tone steady. "I wanted to talk." She gestured for him to come closer. Her curiosity piqued. Midnight, ever watchful, remained at her side. Martin glanced at Midnight, his expression softening. "That's one remarkable animal you've got. I've been thinking a lot about what's been happening around here." Margaret crossed her arms, nodding for him to continue. "I've lived in this village my whole life," Martin said. "Seen my fair share of fear and superstition. But what I saw the other day, how he calmed that boy, how he stood by you, it's clear he's not just some wild animal." Margaret felt a surge of relief. "Thank you, Martin. That means more than you know." He nodded. "I'm not the only one who feels this way. There are others, people who see the good in Midnight. If it comes to it, we'll stand with you." Her gratitude was palpable as she reached out to touch his arm. "Thank you, Martin. That gives me hope." The conversation buoyed her spirits. But the night brought with it a reminder of the lingering danger. As Margaret prepared for bed, Midnight's low growl alerted her to a presence outside. She peered through the curtains, her flashlight in hand, and spotted a figure near her fence. Her stomach knotted. Midnight was already at the door, his body tense. Margaret opened it cautiously, her voice firm as she called out, "Who's there?" The figure froze, and she recognized Jacob's outline. His expression was dark, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his stance. "Jacob," Margaret said, stepping out onto the porch. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze shifting to Midnight. The lynx stood tall, his piercing eyes locked on Jacob. A silent warning. "I just came to talk," Jacob finally said, his voice low and uncertain. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You've made it clear how you feel about Midnight. What more is there to say?" Jacob shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as though searching for the right words. "People are starting to trust him." "Trust you? But that doesn't change what he is." Margaret's patience was wearing thin. "And what is that?" "Jacob. A protector. A loyal companion. Because that's all I've seen." He looked at her, his frustration evident. "You don't get it. Animals like him, they're unpredictable. One day, he might turn." Margaret stepped closer, her voice unwavering. "The only thing unpredictable around here is you, Jacob. Midnight has done nothing but protect this village. Even when you tried to tear him down. Maybe it's time you asked yourself why you're so afraid." Jacob flinched, his expression hardening. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the night. Margaret exhaled, her hands trembling as she closed the door behind her. She knelt beside Midnight, her voice soft but resolute. "They'll see the truth, boy. One way or another. They'll see." As the fire crackled in the hearth and Midnight settled at her feet, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for acceptance wasn't over. But with allies like Martin and the unwavering loyalty of Midnight, she knew they could weather whatever storms lay ahead. In the end, Midnight's steadfast loyalty and Margaret's courage transformed not only their lives but also the heart of a once fearful village. What began as suspicion and hostility grew into respect and understanding as the villagers witnessed Midnight's bravery and unwavering bond with Margaret. Jacob, too, eventually confronted his own fears, recognizing that it wasn't the animal he mistrusted but his own prejudices. Margaret's home, once a symbol of isolation, became a gathering place for the community, a testament to the power of empathy, love, and resilience. Midnight's quiet strength united them, proving that trust and kindness can heal even the deepest divides. As the village moved forward, Margaret and Midnight stood as living reminders that sometimes the fiercest protectors come in the most unexpected forms. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Life Stories and stay tuned for more heartwarming tales. See you in the next video.